Tonight, is it Brexit hanging in the balance or democracy itself? A coup or a promise delivered? MPs return tomorrow with Boris Johnson intending to suspend Parliament for 5 weeks. Will the opposition unite to take control and block a no-deal Brexit? Or are we heading for a snap general election before October 31st? Tonight, 100 people and a panel of politicians from across the spectrum debate the way forward. Welcome to the Channel 4 Brexit Debate. Good evening. Boris Johnson stood on the steps of Downing Street tonight and said he doesn't want a general election. But he's staring at possible defeat tomorrow as critics gang up to stop no deal. He insists there is no way he will ask Brussels for another delay. So a snap election within 6 weeks could be his only way to deliver Brexit by the end of October. The government have refused our invitation to join our panel tonight, but we do have two politicians in favour of going ahead with no deal and two who are doing all they can to stop it. But before we hear from them, let's go first to our audience. Now, Boris Johnson says he doesn't want an election, and nor do you. So is he right? Do you want an election? Hands up. What do you think?
I think we should just leave. Do or die, that's what he's promised us. Let's go.
Who else has got a view on this? Yes, just the gentleman along there.
I don't think a general election is really going to solve anything. I think that we're looking at a political spectrum which is even more split than it was at the last election. We've got the Lib Dems pulling Labour from the Remain side and the Brexit Party pulling the Conservatives on the Leave side. And I think in that situation it's going to become even more fragmented, and then we're going to end up in the same situation we are now, just even worse.
What about over here? Yes, the lady on the second row there. What do you think? Do you want an election?
I totally agree with what that gentleman just said. It doesn't go far enough. It's a step in the right direction, but ultimately it probably won't solve anything and we'll be left in the same position with nobody really knowing what's happening with Brexit. And the gentleman next to you.
Yeah, so I don't see the point of a general election. I voted for Brexit 3 years ago. I voted for parties that promised to deliver on Brexit. In the general election, I voted for the Brexit Party in the European elections. How many times do we have to vote before we can deliver Brexit?
You're all very sceptical. Does anybody think an election is the answer? Is this the right thing to do? Yes, there's a lady there on the back.
We need an election because we had Theresa May, who no one voted for. We've got Boris Johnson, who no one's had the opportunity to vote for. And we've got an undemocratic Brexit because there was never, ever no deal on the table. When I was asked to vote back in 2016, it was vote for the EU or vote to leave. No one said vote for no deal. It's not democratic. We didn't.
Okay,
we didn't
we'll
have
come
no
to you as
deal.
well. Do you want to just reply properly? Don't shout out, because then we'll get a microphone to you.
I'm sorry. Yeah. We all know what we voted for. The question was, do we stay or do we leave?
So you don't want an election?
After we've left.
Right, okay.
Without a deal.
Fine. Well, do join the discussion on Twitter using the hashtag C4Brexit Debate. Supporting Boris Johnson tonight on our panel is the former Cabinet Minister and veteran Eurosceptic John Redwood. From Labour, Clive Lewis is Shadow Treasury Minister. Ian Blackford is leader of the third biggest party in Westminster, the SNP. And Alex Phillips is a newly elected member of the European Parliament for Nigel Farage's Brexit Party. Well, you were there at Downing Street today in the Rose Garden as Boris Johnson was supposed to be threatening your colleagues with deselection if they don't back him tomorrow. What happened? And what did he mean tonight when he said he doesn't want an election?
Well, he meant exactly what he said. He believes it's the duty of this Parliament, elected in 2017, to deliver on the Brexit promise. And the lady's wrong to say nobody voted for Mrs May. Mrs May led the Conservatives. We got a very large number of people voting for us and became, by far and away, the biggest party in the Parliament. The second biggest party in the Parliament, the Labour Party, also campaigned in that election to deliver Brexit. This Parliament needs to deliver it. The Prime Minister is giving the Parliament another opportunity to deliver Brexit, as we should do.
Right, but he's threatening an election, isn't he?
He threatened nobody tonight in his speech in the Rose Garden. He called on all Conservatives to be of goodwill and to back what the government is trying to do. Leaving without a deal, if that's what we have to do, trying to maximise the pressure on our European partners to try and get a deal which is better than leaving without a deal.
Right, but all the papers, all the journalists are being briefed that if you lose tomorrow, then Boris Johnson is going to go for a snap general election on October the 14th. Is that what you understood from being in Downing Street tonight?
No, the opposite. You correctly reported it earlier when you said that the Prime Minister said to the assembled MPs with television cameras present that he didn't want an early election. But of course,
yeah, but if he
can't absolutely rule one out, because if a majority emerged in Parliament to twice vote down the government on a confidence vote, then there would need to be a general election. But we think that is unlikely. The Prime Minister has made it very clear he doesn't want it. He wants Parliament to do the decent thing, implement the wishes of the British people, and get this behind us. There's so many other things that we need to be talking about as a country.
We'll come on to
schools and hospitals and the economy.
Clive Lewis, what do you take from tonight? What is Boris Johnson's plan?
Well, from listening to that, I could hear the Stop the Coup demonstrators in the background over Boris Johnson, which I think tells you so much about where we are in politics at the moment. Our democracy is being threatened by a government that is meant to be ruled by the consent of the public. The public consent doesn't mean that you agree with the government. It means that you expect your government to operate by the rules of democracy, which this government clearly isn't doing, and we can come on to that in a bit. But I thought this was a threat to his MPs to get into line. I'm quite happy for the Conservative Party to tear itself apart. I know that come tomorrow, when we go back to Parliament, the Labour Party will do what is in the best and in the national interest to ensure that we do not leave without a deal. That is our priority. That is what we will make sure happens if we can in Parliament, working with other political parties that don't want to see no deal. And our Brexit, our manifesto, which mentioned Brexit, which talked about Brexit, never mentioned a no-deal Brexit. That was not there. I didn't stand on that manifesto. No Labour politician did, and no Labour politician ever would.
Right, but do you believe you're going to win to stop no deal tomorrow and therefore trigger a general election?
I think looking at the numbers, there's a good chance that we could stop no deal. The legislation has now been put down. We've seen that out today. I think there's every chance, given the number of Conservative MPs who are saying that they will put country before party, at last, it's possible that we may see the government defeated and no deal taken off the table. But there are still lots of caveats to that, because obviously we don't have a written constitution, and there are certain things that the executive can do even if that legislation is passed. So there's lots to see what will happen.
Alex Phillips, how did you read what Boris Johnson said tonight?
It was a bit of a damp squib, wasn't it? I mean, I was there sitting in the back of the car, coming here, tuning in, waiting for a big announcement on something, thinking, oh gosh, is the Maybot going to come back? But actually, he just repeated things he said already and things he's got to keep affirming. This is the Boris Johnson playbook, where he has to demonstrate to people he is committed to delivering Brexit. I believe he actually is. He was in the Vote Leave campaign. I have no reason to doubt him. But he is having to frame this as Parliament versus the people, because that's what it has become. We had a democratic exercise 3 years ago, arguably one of the largest in this nation's history. That was a form of direct democracy. The people spoke, and for 3 years, that has now been delayed, it's been thwarted, people are trying to reverse it in Parliament. The people who are elected to represent the citizens of the UK who voted to leave.
I mean, you can deliver this by just packing up, can't you? And telling all the Brexit Party supporters to back the Conservatives.
No,
in an election. If you do that, you will get the no-deal Brexit you want at the end of October.
I think that's a kind of creative interpretation of where we are at, because actually I think Boris Johnson is gunning for, and he keeps saying he's gunning for, a deal. Now, in the time period we have left, that means dusting off the withdrawal agreement, which I think John and I would both agree isn't leaving the EU. It's subjugation for futurity under various aspects of EU control. And actually, I just want to say, the gentleman over here, he made me think while I was sitting here waiting to have my turn. Always we keep hearing people didn't know what they were voting for. We didn't vote for no deal, etc., etc. What this is are people who voted Remain telling Brexiteers they didn't know what they voted for. Okay. We did. We wanted to leave the single market, the customs union, and the jurisdiction of the ECJ. That is not the withdrawal agreement.
That's not what the main Leave voters were saying.
Ian Blackford.
You can't read my mind.
Hold on a second. Just don't call out, sir. Ian Blackford, are you preparing for an election?
Yes, we are. I think the most important thing that Parliament's got to do tomorrow, to use the phrase, is take back control. Let's remember, members of Parliament are there to represent their constituents. And what we face on the 31st of October is a no-deal Brexit that would threaten jobs, would put people on the door, threaten the supply of food and medicines, and even water supply, which is in the Yellow Harbour.
Look, I did call... Just hang on. I did call on you before, and I will bring you in later, but please don't call out so we can all hear what...
And I'm delighted that what's happened over the course of the last few weeks, that parliamentarians across party, including a number of Conservatives, have acted together in our collective national interest to stop that no deal. Tomorrow is a day that I'm going to be very, very proud of. We can make sure that we push back the day of leaving the European Union into next year. Then, yes, let's have an election, because the fact of the matter is we've got Boris Johnson, who is behaving in an undemocratic fashion. He's seeking to close down Parliament. He's gone to the Queen on the votes of 3 members of the Privy Council that he's chosen, the longest prorogation of Parliament that we've ever seen, simply to stop Parliament doing its job.
But you want to overturn the result of the referendum.
No, I don't.
Now,
I am a Scottish MP.
Which bit is undemocratic?
I am a Scottish MP, and let's not forget, we had a referendum on independence in 2014, and we were told that if we stayed in the UK, that our rights as EU citizens would be respected. The people of Scotland voted by 62% to stay in the European Union. We will not be dragged out of the European Union against the wishes of the Scottish people. That's absolutely crystal clear. And I think even more so now, it is obvious that if Boris Johnson is going to drive us out, it's going to be devastating to jobs in Scotland. And the people of Scotland deserve the right to have a say on their future and remain as a European country. That's the debate that we're having in Scotland.
Thank you. Look, we'll come back to this whole question of what a general election may mean. But this whole sequence of events kicked off with last week's announcement that Parliament would be prorogued or shut down for 5 weeks. So let's have a question from Kate Putnam. Kate.
What is more undemocratic, suspending Parliament or reneging the referendum result?
Clive Lewis.
We live in a parliamentary democracy, and we don't have a written constitution, which I think people are now beginning to understand is quite a problem. And I personally don't think that Brexit in and of itself is its own cause. It's a symptom of a broken political system, a broken economic system. And I would say that if you look throughout history, you can see where politicians, leaders, will use plebiscites or referendum, take that result and do with it as they wish. They will use that result to do whatever it is that they want. And I think that's what we're seeing here. We have a parliamentary democracy, and we also have the result of that referendum. Parliament has spent 3 years trying to ensure that that referendum was enacted upon. That was the consultation that took place. It was to inform Parliament on what to do. Now, I personally, in 2016, I went around to my constituency, to the strongest Remain parts, and I spoke to my constituents, and the vast majority of those constituents said, you know what, we lost. We now need to see Brexit happen, but one that protects jobs, the environment, and the economy.
Did you vote for Article 50?
No, I didn't vote for Article 50. I didn't vote for Article 50, and I'll tell you why, because most of my constituents, Theresa May's deal that was on the table back in 2017, the Article 50 terms and conditions, I could see, like millions of other people, that this was not going to work. And that's what's happened. The Conservative Party hasn't put the national interest first. It's put its own party political interest first, every time. And that's what Labour hasn't been able to support.
John Redwood. What's worse?
I think it's very clear that not honouring the referendum would be a disaster for our democracy and very bad for our Parliament. Because Parliament solemnly agreed to hold a referendum and said in terms that we, the people, would make the decision, not that it was advisory. And our Labour spokesman tonight has a very selective memory of the Labour manifesto in 2017 as well, because that very clearly not only said would they want to assist Brexit, but it set out a very interesting overseas trade policy, for example, which clearly meant they had in mind in those days leaving the customs union as well as the rest of the EU, which is what most Leave voters had in mind as well. There is nothing undemocratic about what the Prime Minister is doing over the timetable for Parliament. Indeed, before Mr Blair, Parliament never met in September at all. And what this Prime Minister is doing is observing the usual tradition that we have a 3-week break for conference, because MPs like to quite often go off to their party conferences and don't want to have to be dragged back for votes or debates they need to participate in. And then we will have a short break, as we usually do once a year, when you prepare for a Queen's speech. And there is plenty of time for Parliament to go all over the arguments about Brexit yet again. I don't suppose we hear anything else apart from them all of this week yet again. We've had 3 years of nothing else. and then there'll be another fortnight before we leave the European Union, when again they can do whatever they like. It's a completely democratic process.
So this is just a sort of a happy coincidence? Well, it stops Parliament doing anything?
It's just false that there's something wrong going on here. Parliament has had 3 years, which it's almost entirely given over to debating and voting on Brexit.
The gentleman here wants to...
And it has twice passed important legislation to say we are leaving. The Prime Minister says Parliament ought to honour its own statutes. If Parliament wants to change its mind, it's still got quite a few debating days where it can say something about it.
On the end there, what do you want to say?
Can I speak? Yeah. Well, Mr Redwood clearly thinks, like Mr Johnson, that we're complete idiots and they can just take us for a complete ride. Shortly ahead of this supposedly binding referendum, your poster boy Nigel Farage said if this results in a narrow victory for Remain of the order of 52 to 48, that will not solve anything and the whole thing will have to be run again. So it suits you to go with the referendum and treat it as sacrosanct when it's in your interest and it keeps the EU's prying eyes out of tax havens. We know what the real reason is for Brexit. We do. We're not idiots. And so if it was a narrow victory for leave, how is it such a holy and important and binding referendum result?
Well, because we made a solemn promise, Parliament and Government, that we would honour the result, that the people were deciding. And as a very young man, one of the first votes I ever cast was in a European referendum when I was on the losing side, and I and people like me who voted then not to stay in the European Economic Community always accepted the verdict, and we didn't expect our Parliament to tear up the verdict or try and find some compromise between our position and theirs. We knew we'd lost, and we accepted the democratic verdict.
Ian Blackford, let's come back to the question. What's more undemocratic, suspending Parliament or reneging the referendum result?
Well, the simple fact of the matter is Boris Johnson is behaving like a tin-pot dictator. He's a coward, and he's running away from Parliament being given the opportunity to legislate to stop no deal. And he's been caught out because we can legislate in the time that we have this week. But not only that, he had the opportunity today to say that he wanted to go to the country to have a general election. This has been his Gordon Brown moment, and he's flunked it. Let's make sure that we remove that cliff edge, we remove the threat of no deal at the end of October. Let's have an election. Let's send a message to Boris Johnson.
Alex Phillips.
Right, OK, first of all, not wanting to sound like an academic, but democracy means power of the people. Parliament is part of democracy. It is an apparatus for delivering that. And we were given the opportunity for one of the first time in my lifetime to actually take part in, well, actually, no, apart from the one about whether he wanted a new system of PR or something other than first past the post. But it's very rare we as the British public get to actually have our say in direct democracy, and we did that. That is the very meaning of democracy, and the fact that it hasn't been delivered, I think even every Remainer in their heart of hearts, even if they're very disappointed by that result, needs to acknowledge that it happened. This gentleman here who was saying something or the other that Nigel Farage said about not respecting results, I was his press officer for 10 years, and that's nothing I ever came across, so I'm glad that you seem to know his almanac greater than I do.
Well, hang on, no, he did say that he would fight on.
Well, there's one thing about fighting on. There's a different thing about respecting a result. I mean, Remainers can fight on once we leave the EU to rejoin as much as they want. In the same way that if Scotland, after having one referendum, wants to try for another independence referendum, fine, that is democracy. But to have a result, and then not even put that result into practice, is the very negation of democracy. It makes the whole system futile. And can I just say as well, all I keep hearing is Article 50. No, all I keep hearing is Article 50 this, Article 50 that, crashing out without a deal. Well, guess what? Article 50 is EU legislation. The Remainers don't like that bit of EU legislation supremacy, do they? They don't like the fact that Article 50 has to have an end date by which it is enacted in Section 1. Inconvenient all of a sudden.
We didn't have to choose to activate Article 50, and I'm glad that Clive and I, and certainly all the SNP MPs, didn't, because we're simply not... You know, the whole thing about the Brexiteers is they simply don't care about the economic damage which is created. What will happen to the manufacturing industry? Because this is all about ideology. No jobs are worth the price of the ideology of the Brexiteers.
Let me get a... I mean, there's lots of hands shooting up. Gentleman there in the blue shirt, yeah.
I think Yes, it is democracy, but we've got a parliamentary democracy. It's where people are elected to represent their constituents in Parliament. When you prorogue Parliament, you shut it down totally. There's no work on any legislation. There's no accountability or scrutiny of the decisions of ministers.
So if I may...
this is just a cowardly attempt to try and avoid scrutiny at a crucial time in our country's history.
Gentleman in the glasses there, your red shirt.
So, I have a question for Mr. Blackford. So, for the SNP, one of the things that would be a big winner is if there was a no-deal leaving scenario, right? It would give you guys the opportunity to have your second referendum, which you want, which you think you will win, then you could leave, then you can rejoin the European Union. Surely, no-deal Brexit is in your best interest.
No, it's not, because in the interim, people in Scotland are going to lose their job. I mean, the government's talked about slaughtering lambs because there will be no market, there will be no export market. This is extraordinary, the impact that a no-deal Brexit would have. I don't want
It's interesting that people are just sort of saying that's nonsense.
No, it's not nonsense, because the government have told us that. The government's preparing for all of that.
But people don't seem to believe
but the point is, but I want Scotland to become independent based on a future of a prosperous, a just Scotland, but I don't want to do it on the backs of a no-deal Brexit that's going to send people into poverty. The simple fact of the matter is people are going to lose their jobs. Unemployment is simply not a price worth paying. I don't want people to lose their jobs in Bristol any more than I want people to lose jobs in Buckie in Scotland. And that's why I work with Clive and others to make sure that we don't have this economic madness, this active economic self-harm that would happen with a no-deal Brexit, which people were not asked to vote on in the referendum in 2016.
Let me just come back into the audience here. The lady in the pink. Yes.
Surely it would make more sense to wait until the middle of October, when there has been work to be done, to see what the terms of any deal might be, before completely trashing the possibility of getting any deal at all, which may then subsequently support Scotland.
Well, the simple fact is... If I could
why don't we let Clive put
the point I'm going to make here now is I find it incredulous that in the 21st century, people like myself and Ian and members of this audience have to sit here and question whether our own government respects the rule of law. That's what this comes down to. And Boris Johnson might not be he may or may not be the tin pot dictator we all fear, but what he is doing is setting a precedent for the future, where others can come along. And if they don't like what Parliament is saying, the People's Parliament, democratically elected MPs, don't like what they're saying, don't want them to be able to look over what they're doing, to scrutinise what they're doing, they get rid of them. That's what this is about, and that is wrong.
Gentlemen, look, I'm going to have to ask you to be quiet until I invite you in. You keep shouting out, you've got to stop. John Redwood, could you answer that point? You know, are you not concerned, as a long-standing parliamentarian, at the precedents being set here? A parliament being shut down, so it reduces the time for discussion, reduces its opportunity to stop no deal. Your own colleagues being threatened effectively with deselection, losing the whip if they go against the party line, a party line that is the opposite of what the party line was before, when the people who were in the cabinet defied the party whip. Are these not worrying precedents for democracy?
I strongly believe in the importance of Parliament, and I think I've already dealt with those 2 points that have been made. And I find it very disappointing that the SNP representative just puts out entirely false or unbased negative forecasts on what might happen to our country.
Government forecasts.
Look, I didn't interrupt
comes from
you.
the Treasury.
Well, let me explain the point, that we were given a whole set of bogus short-term forecasts about 500,000 or more job losses, a big crash in house prices, and a move into recession as soon as we voted to leave the European Union. That was a 1 to 2 year forecast. All of that was completely untrue.
Have you looked at the currency?
And we now have a reheating of those to say that will now happen if we leave the EU without a deal. Now, of course, what we need to be discussing is none of these things. We need to be discussing the big world slowdown, the manufacturing collapse around the world, the fact that our economy, like other economies, actually needs a boost now. And that is going to be so much easier if we have some of that money back from the European Union, well, we get all of it back, but we have some of that back to spend on our priorities,
tax havenery,
to give that boost to the economy and our public services we need to give. And a lot of Leave voters voted, amongst other things, to have that money back because they know that our schools, our hospitals need it and our economy needs some tax cuts.
Briefly, Clive,
and that will become possible once we leave.
Just interesting term, boost to our economy. You look at the people who are politically championing Brexit by and large, people like John Redwood, Rees-Mogg and others. You know, no disrespect, but I looked at your voting record, John, over the last 20 or so years. You wrote the book on NHS privatisation, one that your party has followed through on. You're a climate change denier. Your voting record is where you hammer the poor at every opportunity. These are the people that are driving Brexit. That's what we're going to get more of. Heading towards the Trump trade deal, that's what this is about.
Now, tonight, Boris Johnson is still insisting that Britain will leave the European Union, no ifs, no buts, on October the 31st. But if he's defeated in the House of Commons tomorrow, his only way of doing that might be through a general election. Now, before the break, we just got on to what the consequences of a no-deal Brexit at the end of October would be. So let's pursue that more, and a question from Justine Silver.
In a no-deal scenario, how will government ensure that the NHS is not a casualty?
Alex Phillips.
In fact, actually, very easily, because we'll have full control over what we do to determine things like workers who come into the country. We would therefore allow, very happily, much like we get many workers from the Commonwealth countries who come and contribute to the NHS, so we will allow EU citizens to do the same. And equally, can I just say, there's been a lot of scare stories around about medicine stockpiling. The MHRA has said that it will recognise any European certified medicines. It will not block those coming into the UK. And in fact, the EU's own Medicine Association has actually said that there's 31 medicines out of thousands, 31, 19 of which are for humans, the rest are veterinary, that they might worry that there could be circulation problems. So when you look at that, and those are fact-based things, I'm not inventing those, when you look at that, governments are able to manage periods of change. Many policies that are enacted by governments, both geopolitically that affect your country and are managed domestically, can be prepared for. What we've actually seen is because we've had this frustration of delivering on the result by our Parliament, we've not got down to the nitty-gritty sensibly, and because the previous government and the previous Chancellor largely put a stop on preparations, we're actually having to catch up on that now. But as far as I'm concerned, from everything that's being said from Whitehall and things being said across the Channel in Brussels, both sides are now prepared for a no deal. And believe you me, both sides don't want to see a cataclysmic fallout from this. It will not happen. Okay. It's that simple.
Hold on. You're not. There's no microphone on you. Hang on one sec. Just hang on one sec. I'll come to you in a second. John Redwood, answer the question. How do you stop the NHS being a casualty of a no-deal Brexit? We've seen the government's own assessments. We've seen the Health Secretary unable to guarantee that anyone will, that people won't die as a result of a no-deal Brexit. How are you going to guarantee it?
Well, it's far too pessimistic. First of all, let me reject the idea that I've ever favoured privatising the NHS. I've always been a strong supporter, as has my party, of the principle of free care at the point of need for any individual under the NHS system. And we have already shown that there'll be a lot more money going into the NHS, which is a generally welcomed phenomenon, and that will be easier once we've saved the money we're currently contributing to the European Union. As we've heard, we can make our own decisions about inviting in skilled people if we need more skilled people from overseas, because we will control our own borders. And I've asked a question about, has any pharmaceutical company on the continent currently supplying the NHS told us it's going to break its contract or refuse to send us pharmaceuticals once we've left? And I've been assured by the government, no, there is no such company, because of course every pharmaceutical
but you're
company
sort of deliberately
on the
missing
continent,
the point, aren't you? Because
which
the point
is
getting stuff in to meet demand.
Yes, but we
on
control
time.
the ports to get things in.
And the Health Secretary has had to lay contingencies to fly in medicines, on sort of emergency.
But it's always wise to have contingencies, because you could, under the current regime in the EU, have a French strike or something, and you need contingencies. But I'm absolutely sure that the British government and the ports of Dover and Felixstowe and Harwich and all the others want to facilitate the movement.
So you're sure there's no problem?
And I do not buy this scare story. They're going to keep the drugs out.
No, hang on. I want to bring in Ian Blackford now. Are you as confident about the NHS?
No, I'm not. I'm deeply worried. And one of the things we should be talking about is what's happened to the EU citizens that are already here, that are friends, our neighbours, our partners and so on. And many of them are deeply worried. They're having to apply for the rights that they should have automatically to stay here. I have had people in tears in my surgery. And the fact that we have not had the welcome for people that we should have. But let me give you an example. And I want to give you an example of a young vet that I spoke to in Portree in the Isle of Skye. She's a student vet and she wants to stay in Scotland. But under the rules that the UK government are bringing in, she will have to earn £30,000 a year. There is no young vet in the Isle of Skye that will be earning £30,000 a year. We will lose out. She will lose out, and it's a direct consequence of the vindictive nature that this government has towards migration. If we don't have
the
that
question
talent,
is about the NHS.
Well, we need, so in the NHS, we need the nurses and the doctors that come from Europe. But it's not just the NHS. It's our academic community. 27% of the academic staff at Edinburgh University are EU citizens. And the Vice-Principal has told me that that talent pool has started to dry up as a direct consequence of everything which has happened over the course of the last 3 years. Our public services will suffer, our academia will suffer, there will be a real threat to our communities that happens as a consequence of this. And to blindly ignore it is just simply shameful from the Brexiteers. And it is because this is simply driven by ideology. It's about returning to a 1950s imperial Britain, turning our back on our EU partners where we've delivered peace, because the EU, amongst other things, has been a peace project on the back of 2 world wars. And the fact that the Brexiteers want to turn their back on that is absolutely shameful.
Gentleman there.
So Ian, I'm a Brexiteer. I'm also a cancer surgeon in the NHS. My father is a doctor that fits limbs on artificial limbs on people that have lost limbs in the NHS. My sister is a GP. My wife is a pharmacist in the NHS. And we vote for Brexit. You don't have to be in the EU to be a doctor or a nurse. We can recruit from the 92% of the world that don't live in the EU.
OK, thank you. Gentleman there, on the end.
I wasn't born in the UK. In fact, I've only naturalised recently down the road from here in the town hall. All right, but I voted for Leave, and you're backward-looking, we're all nostalgic, we don't care about other European citizens. It's just ridiculous. The problem we've had for the last 3 years is there's been a rearguard action by Remainers such as yourself trying to rerun a debate you should have had 3 years ago, and that has undermined our ability as Leavers and everyone else in this country to protect and promote the rights of other citizens in this country. Commonwealth, European and everyone else. You should be on the same side as us and we should all be fighting for the rights of those people.
There's a lady there in the blue top.
Thank you. I'm a little bit fed up with listening to politicians talking about I want this, I want that, with the Labour Party, with the Conservatives. Why don't you all just get together, let's get a bunch of good academics together and actually get this thing done and do some action instead of just talking about it for 3 full years. It's just shameful. We're paying you to do a job. Get on with it. If you're in business, we'd have sacked you long ago, but we can't.
OK. We've got a sort of 50-50 split in this audience. We've heard a lot from people who are saying get on with it and aren't sharing Ian Blackford's concerns. Who's worried about the consequences of no deal? Yes, the gentleman here. Just wait for a microphone to get to you. Ian.
The kind of flippant way, Alex, you describe, there just being a few medicines that might not be available.
It's not a flippant way to describe. This is actual factual information I gave you.
I'm talking.
You weren't listening, though, were you? Not very well.
I listened to you before. I listened to you before. I listened to you before. So, the few medicines you say flippantly that might not be available, I am epileptic and I need those medicines. So actually this kind of, oh yeah, it's going to be fine, it's just not good enough.
Who else? No, but I gave you factual information.
Who else is concerned? Who else is concerned? Yes, the gentleman there in the white shirt. Yeah.
The point I'd make to the panel is if a no-deal Brexit doesn't matter. Why are we having to spend £2 billion in a period of austerity to get ourselves out of the mess we're in? I run a business with clients across Europe, and they think we are absolutely mad for the decisions that we've taken. It is terrible for many businesses, and people who don't listen to those point of views simply haven't run a business and know what is involved. And it is the opportunity cost of what we're giving away by this Brexit debate, because although the economy hasn't gone into recession, it could be so much stronger and we could be focusing on many other things if we weren't heading towards this disastrous no-deal outcome.
Lady behind in the red.
I also work in the NHS. I'm a doctor and I've been an academic in Cambridge. We already have a massive recruitment crisis. Workforce planning in the NHS is awful, and I know so many EU doctors who are planning on leaving and academics, so I'm really worried about the consequences for the NHS.
John Redwood, it's not just medicine, is it? It's things like food, you know. We have Michael Gove going on the television saying there's going to be no shortage of food, and then the next day, the retailers coming on and saying, well, yes, there is.
Well, I didn't hear main supermarkets saying that. I heard representative bodies, so-called, saying this. I have every confidence
of the supermarket.
Well, I have every confidence in our supermarkets. I think we have some great businesses.
But they don't. That's the point.
And I listen to them, and I do not believe they will have empty shelves. I think they have perfectly good arrangements for bringing food in.
They didn't say empty shelves. They said there'd be shortages of fresh food.
Well,
and that's the issue here, isn't there? That you've got to be straight with people.
I just don't accept that. Why should there be any shortages of fresh food? Because once again, it's this category error that Remain are making, that the UK authorities control the ports that might or might not delay the imports coming in. And we've been assured by the government and HMRC that they will not delay things unduly at the ports, and that were there any sign that any additional checks were getting in the way, they would waive the checks so that they could get the food in. Because this food that will be coming in on the 1st of November after we've left will come from the same sources with the same documentation, the same electronic manifests, the same trucks sealed and with their reporting systems through computers as the day before, and we know they're approved to EU standards. So there's absolutely no need to delay the trucks at the border on the 1st of November, because we know what's in them electronically, and we live in the age of computers.
Clive Lewis,
so I do not buy this idea that the food is going to get caught.
Well, we know what the leaked document that came out, one of the lines that came out from government is that they were confident that people would have the requisite amount of calories. So you can make up your calories from quite a varied number of sources, custard, carnation milk, tin products, but fresh food couldn't be guaranteed. Now, that's not me, that's your own civil service that's saying that, and the reports that they are producing. But I just want to come back a second to what Alex said, which pretty much sounded like her boss, Nigel Farage, was going to be stood at a port with his arms open to the Commonwealth. Now, that wasn't what he was saying back in 2016. In fact, I remember him quite clearly standing in front of a rather nasty racist poster. So if we want to now rewrite history to say that Brexit is all about opening the doors to black people across the world, well, fantastic. But that, I think, somehow, Nigel Farage has been very quiet on this issue quite recently, isn't the case. And I'll tell you what now, because I want to make one more point here. When there are food shortages, when the NHS does go to the dogs, does go to the wolves, there will be people in the Brexit Party and beyond who will blame it on migrants, who will blame it on foreigners, who will blame it on those same people. You've done it before, you'll do it again. That's what we've seen throughout history, and it will happen again. So I think we have to be quite clear here. They want us to believe that food will be fine, that the NHS will be fine. But actually, if you look at the NHS already, there are tens of thousands of nurses. There's a shortfall of tens of thousands of nurses. The NHS is struggling as it is at the moment. And that's before no deal takes place. And that's before, and I think no deal is bad enough as it is, before we have to go cap in hand to Donald Trump, who wants the NHS on the table.
Briefly,
that's what I'm scared about.
How long do you believe the chaos would last in your terms, the shortages?
One day too much. Would
we get over them?
I'm no more of an expert than anyone else, but what I do know is that when you read the documentation, Yellowhammer and other documents that have come out from the civil service that have been out, they paint a very grim picture about. That's not me saying that. That's not politicians saying that. That's the government's own civil service.
This will be a period of difficulty that we'll get through. Do you believe that's true?
One of the things in the Yellowhammer document it talks about the potential risk to fresh water supplies affecting hundreds of thousands of people. Now, just think about that. Think about not having water for a day or two, because the simple fact of the matter is that our treatment facilities for water, the chemicals, tend to come from Europe, tend to come from France. When the government is suggesting that people may not have fresh water supplies, what are we doing? What are we doing?
Let's talk about these potential interruptions that the government's own reports have raised. Now, even the supporters of no-deal Brexit, most of them accept that there could be some disruption, there could be some difficulties. How long are you prepared to accept difficulties and disruption? Yes, down here on the front row.
So, while we talk about the difficulty of a no-deal Brexit, let us talk about the most egregious affront to democracy. Because when people like me, who voted Remain, and many of us here, which represent nearly half the country, are fearful of the prospect of a no-deal Brexit, we should take a look at the source of Project Fear, Mr. John Redwood himself. He goes on national television, misrepresents the facts, tells people that we should go for a no-deal Brexit, while at the same time he advises his investor clients that they should reduce their investment in the UK because a no-deal Brexit raises economic uncertainty.
Off the point, but I've got to let John Redwood. I've got to let John Redwood answer that briefly.
Well, it's a simple lie. As anyone who reads my blog will know, I'm very optimistic about the UK's prospects, especially when we've left the European Union, and think we will be a very good place for investment, and I'm all in favour of more jobs and investment. So don't mislead people about my views.
Who was the person who called out as long as it takes? I'm prepared to take. Yeah, OK. You're prepared for shortages forever, are you?
Well, it won't be forever, will it? We just
how
don't
long
know.
do you think it would be?
What I want to say is that gentleman over there, a Remainer, says, and the Remainers all say that they're worried about this, that, and the other. What about the people who, the majority who voted, the Brexiteers? What happens? We're always told by the Remainer parties, the public want another vote. I'm sorry, but the public don't want another vote. The majority of us don't.
That's another question. The lady here in the blue, and then we'll move on.
Yes, I voted to stay in the EU, however I accept the Brexit result, and you don't know, and you can't read the minds, as the man said over there, you can't read my mind about why I voted Brexit. No, we can't. But you don't know that the 51% all wanted a no deal. How do you know that?
Nobody's arguing that.
OK.
But the 45% also say maybe work together and come to a
But no one can work together. Yeah, no one can work together.
I just argued we should work together to support our Commonwealth and European citizens.
So we have talked about whether democracy is being cheated in any way. We've talked about some of the consequences of a no-deal Brexit at the end of October if it goes ahead. But what happens next? The question everyone's trying to figure out tonight. If there is a snap general election, and the speculation is October the 14th now, who will get your vote? Now, have any of you changed your minds in terms of who you will vote for at the next election in order to get what you want on Brexit? Yes, here on the front row.
Yes, I've decided to vote Lib Dem.
From
and
where?
the reason being is because both parties, Labour and Conservatives, are so poles apart, they create a vacuum in the middle. And people want to be able to have some sort of a way of Parliament to be able to debate every single step. For the next 5 years, on Project No It Won't, or Project Fear on this side as they call it, we have no idea what's going to happen over the next 5 years. So my dream is we have a hung Parliament so that we have to debate, like we're doing at the moment, every single step of the way, until we've worked out the mess.
And you want to remain, presumably?
I'm a Remainer.
Right.
I believe in a referendum, but I'm a Remainer, yes.
Yeah, just behind. Have you changed your view? How are you going to vote?
Well, I can't vote, but it seems to me that there's something genuinely broken at the heart of British politics. We seem to, have a sort of integrity crisis. I mean, whichever side of the debate you're on, whether you want a second referendum or no deal, look at the European elections, where people voting for the Labour and Conservative parties, a traditional dominant party of this country, or they're voting for the Brexit Party and the Liberal Democrats, who are clear about their Brexit positions and weren't tainted by having run the government in the past. I mean, to me, it just seems that there's something broken at the heart of British politics.
Okay.
There seems to be so much
Thank
flying.
you. And just clarify why you can't vote.
Oh, I'm under 18.
You're under 18, fine, OK. Who has changed their view in order to achieve a Brexit outcome in terms of how you would vote? Yeah, the gentleman and the lady next to you.
Yeah, I've been a Conservative activist all my life, principally because it supports a sound economy. But if this becomes a single-issue election about a no-deal Brexit, I can't support the Conservatives because of the damage it will do to the economy.
So how would you vote?
I'd vote Liberal Democrat.
OK, and the lady next to you.
Yeah, I don't know I'd go quite as far, but certainly I'm considering my position. If that is true, that indeed there is a general election, and I am a Conservative councillor, I will be seriously considering my vote, because for me, there was not no deal on the ballot paper. So for me, it depends what the manifesto is going to be saying. But I'm a London-based councillor, and Wimbledon Park, my ward, was 75% to remain. I voted to remain. However, I have bought the withdrawal agreement. I have bought with moving
So
out.
you're thinking of voting Lib Dem similarly?
I don't know, but I certainly will
John
not
Redwood, should she be
considering.
expelled from the party?
I'm pleased to say I don't have that power, and no, I'm
well,
not
I'm asking you for an
recommending it.
opinion. She's a Conservative councillor. She's
Our
saying she's
MP,
thinking of voting
Stephen
Lib Dem.
Hammond is suffering that very prospect. So answer that. Should Stephen Hammond be deselected?
It is not my job to decide who is in the Conservative Party, and
Answer
I'm
the
very
question.
happy for the Conservative Party to be a pretty broad church, and I encourage as many as possible to stay in it and support the Prime
So
Minister we've
neither our
recently
lady
elected.
here nor Stephen Hammond should be expelled?
I'm not expressing a view on that. The others will make that
You don't
decision.
have an opinion?
No, because I haven't investigated what they've said and what they're doing. No, I don't judge people without facts.
Yes, here on the front row. You've been trying to get in for a while.
Yeah, normally I vote Labour Party all the time. But now, with this issue, if there's general election, I'm going to vote Conservative or Brexit. Simply because that is the only two party that is actually responding, trying to save the democracy. Labour, you are failing everybody. Come on, you're trying to frustrate the people's choice. They want to leave. What can't you understand? Let's negotiate after we've left. Listen, let's leave first, then let's carry on negotiating.
OK.
You understand? That's it.
I want to get a question to the panel from Eleanor Bradford. Eleanor, where are you? Yes, on the front here.
What will happen if a general election produces another minority government?
Clive Lewis.
It depends on which minority government it is. If it's a minority government that is from Labour, Liberal Democrat, Green, SNP, then I think that would mean that there would be a good chance that we would be able to get a second a public vote, basically, in effect. And I think that would decide the fate of the country. I think if that happened, that would be the likely outcome.
Why do you think you'd be able to get that if you're a minority government?
I think, well, because we would have thought we would have had the confidence of Parliament and therefore gone to Her Majesty to form a government, if that's the minority government that we have. Now, don't forget, it wouldn't necessarily have Conservatives inside that government, but they may well, on the specific issue of being able to get a second referendum, the public vote, they may well vote with us. So that's how it could happen.
That is clearly the great fear, isn't it, Ian Blackford, expressed right at the beginning of this programme, that another election will solve nothing.
No, I don't believe that's the case. And, you know, when you look at Scotland, to answer the question that was asked, we have proportional representation in the Scottish Parliament. So we work as a minority government, and we have to seek the support of other parties to get our budget through, because we work together. And that's the thing that Theresa May never understood when she was Prime Minister. She was a minority Prime Minister, and all she sought to do was try and hold a broken party together. She never sought to reach a compromise across Parliament. That's what we do in the Scottish Parliament. Look, I'm afraid in the SNP, we will work with others to try and save all of us from this no-deal Brexit. But we won the European elections in Scotland. We got 38% of the vote. We've been in power for 12 years. The people of Scotland have given their support to the SNP, and the day when the people of Scotland complete that journey to become an independent European nation against the chaos of Westminster is close at hand. And I welcome the opportunity to put ourselves in front of the Scottish people in a few weeks and ask for their support.
And Clive Lewis, if it becomes obvious that Jeremy Corbyn cannot unite the opposition, should he step aside for somebody who could?
I think Labour's been quite clear that no deal would be the worst possible outcome. And I think Jeremy Corbyn, as leader of the opposition, should be, if there is a caretaker government or a minority administration, and I think Jeremy Corbyn should lead that as the largest party in Parliament or as the leader of the opposition. But clearly, if you can't command a majority in the House to be able to see through the legislation that you require, then I think you have to look at all other options about who could do that. I think that's quite straightforward, if you have said that no deal is the one outcome that you don't want.
So Labour would have to look at a different...
I think that would have to be kept on the table, yes.
OK. Alex Phillips, what do you think is going to happen? I mean, is the Brexit Party going to be wiped out in a snap election?
Okay,
or are you going to be the kingmakers?
No, OK, so first of all, it's a very pertinent question, can I just say, because I think what the last 3 years has shown us is there is something fundamentally broken with the democratic system, or perhaps veering away from democratic system we have of two-party politics in this country. Will the Brexit Party be wiped out? No. If you look at polling, yes, we were leading in the polls before Boris Johnson became PM, and now we've... I think our polling's about half to 15%, but that polling is staying steady. That's what I'd like to call the Farage 15. It isn't accessible to Boris. Nigel Farage and the ardent supporters of Brexit, who wouldn't necessarily ever lend their vote to the Conservative Party, are steadfast on that.
So
I just want to make one other point, though, very briefly. What we're looking at, you know, what's so interesting is when you look at those opposed to Brexit being delivered, if they could form a coalition or agree on who should be the standard bearer for that, they would have called a vote of no confidence and done it already.
Well,
they fight like cats in a bag.
Last word, John Redwood. I mean, it's possible an election solves nothing, isn't it?
Well, we get this corrosive pessimism the whole time from those who support staying in or are dithering over whether they want a second referendum or just to revoke Article 50, and coupled with nasty slurs on people misrepresenting their views. I would urge them to be positive about our country and to accept the verdict of the British people. I do not see how a second referendum solves anything, because we've heard from the Liberal Democrat leader that if she lost the referendum again, which I think she would, she wouldn't accept that verdict either.
We're out of time. We've got to leave it there. Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you to the panel. Thank you to the audience here and those of you watching at home. It gets even more complicated when MPs go into Parliament tomorrow morning. Join us again tomorrow at 7 o'clock for Channel 4 News to find out what happened. For now, good night.